Boldwood presents Summer at the French Riviera, written by Jennifer Bohnet and read by Julia Franklin. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. Gabriella Jacques was more tired than she'd care to admit. All through the months of January, February and into March, sheer adrenaline had kept her going and boosted her flagging spirits when she wavered with the effort of organising the move to France. It would, she knew, be worth it in the end, but selling and moving house for only the second time in her life was far more stressful than she'd anticipated. There were so many bittersweet memories of her time living in Dartmouth, the town that had adopted her as one of their own, her life with Eric and, when Harriet was born, their happy family life. Until it all changed when Eric died. Not that she wasn't looking forward to returning to her childhood home in Antibes-Juan-les-Pins. She most definitely was. The chance of a proper family reconciliation, with no more broken promises, had to be seized and brought to fruition, if at all possible. Elodie, her 24-year-old granddaughter, had carried her along on a wave of hyper-energetic enthusiasm, as well as practicality, although even she was starting to flag this last week of February. Since their return from Juan-les-Pins in France 2 days after New Year, with the decision made to move there permanently, the two of them had gone through the long and continually evolving to-do list that had been the first thing Elodie had started writing, sitting at the breakfast table the morning after they had arrived home. Every time they ticked something off as done, another job invariably took its place. So much to do. I suppose it will all come together in the end, Gabby sighed. Elodie glanced at her grandmother. Are you sad about selling this house? We could rent it out instead. Give you an income. Gabby shook her head. No, a clean break is better. We are going to be too far away to be able to keep an eye on things, so it would mean the hassle of getting an agent to handle things. And I'm a bit anti-agents at the moment, as you know. I just not realized how much was involved. When your grandfather and I bought this house, I remember it being a lot simpler. But then in those days we didn't have so many things. Having to go through the contents of a house that had been a home for over 3 decades and share unwanted, unneeded possessions between the local charity shops before consigning the rest as rubbish to the bin had been unsettling to say the least. Everything Gabby had picked up seemed to taunt her with some unspoken memory, demanding attention before she disposed of it. Elodie gave her grandmother a concerned look. Gabby, more her mother than grandmother if the truth be told, had been the one constant presence in her life since she was 4 years old, and Harriet, her mother, had forsaken them both for Australia. At New Year, Gabby had celebrated not only her 70th birthday, but also their joint decision to move back to the villa of her childhood, that she'd inherited from her father, Hervé. When Harriet's unexpected decision to join them for New Year in Juan-les-Pins had culminated in Gabby inviting Harriet to move into the villa with them, Elodie had been both shocked and wary of her mother's acceptance. She had the feeling that adjusting to having the stranger who was her mother living in the same house was going to take some time. Has Harriet given you a date for when she's coming? Elodie asked. The original plan had been for Harriet, who was currently renting a small cottage on the outskirts of Bristol, to join them within a fortnight of their return from France and help with the packing up of the house. But she'd rung Gabby to say it would be the end of the month before she could make it, if not later. It had proved to be later. The day after tomorrow, Gabby said now. Cancelling at the last moment seems to be a habit of hers, Elodie said. with a sceptical look. "Let's hope she doesn't cancel for a second time. I suppose she could have changed her mind about moving with us." She glanced at her grandmother. "I'll ring her again this evening." Gabby gave an inward sigh. She too worried about Harriet cancelling again. But the last time they'd spoken, she'd insisted that she was on board with their future plans for a life together on the French Riviera. All Gabby could do was to hope and pray that she meant it. That Harriet wouldn't be the reason for her family falling apart again. She wished for nothing more than that both her daughter and her granddaughter would eventually form a conventional, loving, mother-daughter relationship. After all, she, Gabriella Jacques, wouldn't be around forever. Chapter 1. No matter how well-organised a house move is, something always goes wrong on the day. Things get broken. Empty rooms show their desperate need for decoration. Boxes are dumped into the wrong rooms. And moving-in day invariably descends into a chaotic shambles. Which is when the conscious thought, "Why on earth did I think moving here was a good idea?" becomes lodged in the brain. For Harriet Rogers, standing in the room that was to be hers in Villa de l'Espoir, that moment came as she watched the removal men drive away, leaving herself, Gabby and Elodie, facing a veritable pile of boxes that would, once unpacked, become a recyclable mountain in its own right. The fact that, for once, the sun had hidden behind a sky full of grey clouds had added to the frustration of the day. Now, as the time approached 6 o'clock, the sun had finally decided to shine on this, their first evening in Antibes-Juan-les-Pins. Gabby was in the kitchen, going through various boxes with the word "kitchen" written on them in red, that had actually reached their correct destination. Thankfully, the kettle and the microwave had surfaced early on, largely, Harriet suspected, due to the fact that the removal men needed copious amounts of tea and biscuits to keep them going. Elodie had done a dash to the nearest boulangerie at midday, buying freshly filled baguettes for them all, and a tarte tatin to slice up. Harriet ran her hand through her hair and sighed. This last week had been difficult. When she'd finally arrived in Dartmouth to help pack up Gabby's house, Elodie, in particular, had made it clear to Harriet that she'd let them down by not coming to help earlier, adding to the guilt that Harriet already felt. The tentative relationship that had started to develop between the two of them over Christmas and New Year had proved to be a fragile bond that needed more nourishing, not the neglect that had occurred over the last couple of months. Now they were all actually together in Villa de l'Espoir. All Harriet's doubts broke through her carefully constructed mind barrier and rushed to the surface. How could she explain how terrified and anxious she'd felt at the thought of returning to Dartmouth and potentially meeting up with people from her past? The less time she spent there limited the likelihood of that happening, particularly if she stayed in the house and didn't venture out. She eased her guilt by making a secret pact with herself that she'd work extra hard in France to help to get the villa straight. By arriving so late to help, Harriet's plan had almost worked. But then, on their last evening, Gabby had insisted on treating them all to fish and chips, to be eaten on Bayard's Cove. "I want to make a new, happy Dartmouth memory for the three of us," she'd said. The late March evening air had been cool, but with a welcome feeling of spring all around, with daffodils in the various planters on the embankment. The town had been quiet as they'd walked through and bought their supper from Elodie's favourite fish and chip shop, before making their way to Bayard's Cove. Glasses of wine were bought from the pub, the Dartmouth Arms, and sitting on a bench on the cove overlooking the river, the three of them had tucked into their fish and chips. Eating her supper, Harriet had watched the activity on the river, The lower ferry, with its tug alongside, didn't look a lot different to the one she'd grown up with, the one she'd routinely jumped on to go to Paynton or Torquay. The ramp had still clattered and jarred its way down noisily onto the access slope, as the ferry had motored in far enough for the two to fit together safely for vehicles to drive off, and those waiting along the embankment to board. Gabby had been the first to finish her food, and as she had screwed up the packaging, she'd started to reminisce. I remember sitting here so many times with Eric, and the two of you at different times when you were younger. And now, here we are, a three-generation family, making a Dartmouth memory to take with us into our new lives. She'd been silent for a moment before turning to Harriet. Do you remember coming here with your dad? Of course. Our Sunday mornings together were special. He'd buy a pint of beer for himself, a lemonade for me, and we'd share a large packet of crisps. Harriet had smiled at the memory. The times I tried to get him to buy me a proper drink. I was 18 before he'd even buy me a lemonade shandy. She shook her head. If he'd ever heard about the cider she and her friends downed on a Saturday evening, he'd never let on. Screwing up her own empty packaging, she'd held out her hand for Gabby's and Elodie's. I'll go put these in the bin. I'll take the glasses back to the pub while you do that, Elodie had said. Walking across to the rubbish bin, Harriet had smothered a sigh, remembering how numb she'd felt for months after her dad had died, unable to process her grief about the loss in her life, or cope with the huge cavity it had created. Saying she was devastated didn't come close to how she'd truly felt. She might have been almost 20 years old, but childlike, she'd assumed that he'd always be there, to interrogate her boyfriends, to tell her off when she did something stupid, to finally walk her down the aisle when she married the love of her life, and later to bounce his grandchildren on his knee. He and her mum had been such a perfect fit, the yin and yang of her life. She loved them both dearly, and had promised her dad she would look after her mother. A promise, she was aware, she had spectacularly broken with her actions after his death. Thankfully, he had never known how badly she had behaved, how promiscuous she'd been, or the selfish way she'd left the two most important people in her life and fled to the other side of the world. Now, she was back from Australia, and the three of them were reunited. She intended to do everything in her power to make amends to them both. Gabby, who'd greeted her return without voicing any recrimination she might have harboured, had accepted her return with a true mother's love. Elodie, though, had taken a while to come to terms with her mother being back in her life. Her wary reconciliation at Christmas in Antibes-Juan-les-Pins had shown that it wouldn't be easy establishing a mother-daughter relationship after an absence of 20 years, that it would have to be worked towards. Bridges between them needed to be built. Old wounds needed to heal, and, at the very least, a tentative trust had to establish itself. Healing the breach with Elodie was the most important of several problems that Harriet needed to address to regain her own self-respect. Hattie? Is it really you? A woman's voice had broken into her thoughts. Her fear of being seen had been realised. And of course, of all people, it had to be her best friend from Torquay. Lizzie, fancy seeing you. Despite herself, Harriet had found herself smiling at her old friend, as Lizzie had started to chat away excitedly. Oh, lovely to see you after all these years. We must have a catch-up. You back for good? Lizzie had asked. It's lovely to see you, too, Harriet had said, starting to try and to explain that she was back in Europe for good, but about to move to France, when an excited Lizzie had interrupted her. Do you remember my daughter, Kelly? No, of course you won't. She was a baby when you left. Kelly, this is my best friend, Harriet, from years ago. She's been in Australia for years. Not waiting for an answer, Lizzie had babbled on. We're all so thrilled. You must remember Jack Ellicott, American. Came here the year we started college before he disappeared back to the US unexpectedly. Wow! Kelly is marrying his son next month. Would you believe? She went to the US for work experience. She's a video game designer, and it's the place to be, apparently, and met Nathan. We couldn't believe it when he turned out to be Jack's son. Such a small world these days. You must come to the wedding. I'll send you an invite. Your mother still lives at the same address? Same address, Harriet had said, telling herself it still was. Until tomorrow at least, so not a downright lie. Besides, Gabby had arranged for the post to be forwarded to France, so the invite would reach her eventually. She'd turned to Kelly. Congratulations. We need to catch the next ferry, so we can't stop and chat right now, Lizzie had continued, but it's been a lovely surprise bumping into you. We'll have a proper catch-up at the wedding. Come on, Kelly. Harriet had watched the two of them walk along the quay towards the ferry before she rejoined Gabby and Elodie. Was that Lizzie? Gabby had asked. Yes, she hasn't changed a bit, Harriet had laughed. I didn't do much talking. I'd forgotten how she used to gabble away. It's not until she draws breath that you can get a word in. Right. Should we go home for that early night we promised ourselves? Busy day tomorrow? And the three of them had left Bayard's Cove and started to walk homewards. Harriet had kept the news that she'd been invited to a wedding to herself. Thankful she had a cast-iron excuse for not attending. She'd be out of the country. Meeting Lizzie unexpectedly had been lovely, but it was enough. The thought of meeting other people from her past en masse at a wedding reception terrified her. Even now, a day or so later, standing in her new bedroom in the villa and remembering that evening, Harriet felt a wave of anxiety seep through her body. People had long memories for juicy gossip and hearsay. The hope that they would show understanding and compassion if they heard the truth was not something that Harriet had ever thought likely. Thankfully, she was in France now, where nobody knew or cared about her past. A past where she'd selfishly screwed up her own life, not caring about how much her actions affected others. It was time to try to redeem herself, in Gabby and Elodie's eyes, and pray they would both give her the second chance that deep down she'd wanted for so long. Crossing over to and opening the French windows of her bedroom, Harriet pushed back the shutters and stepped out onto the small balcony. Her bedroom, at the back of the villa, overlooked the garden and the pool, both of which looked in need of some loving care. For the first few weeks, here in France, she'd concentrate on trying to break down the barrier that she'd sensed Elodie had erected around herself, whilst helping Gabby sort the villa before starting to think about what she was going to do. She didn't need to work, as money wasn't an issue. The amount of Todd's life insurance, coupled with his investments, had come as a welcome surprise. She could live anywhere and do pretty much what she wanted. What she couldn't do was sit around for the rest of her life. Was she brave enough to try to pick up that long-ago dream, to make a name for herself as an artist? But, more to the point, had she left it too late? Surely she at least owed it to herself to find out. Harriet pulled the box marked bed linen towards her and took out sheets, pillowcases, and a duvet cover. She'd make up both her bed and Gabby's before going downstairs to help with whatever else needed doing this evening. Having her bed ready for her to collapse into at the end of the day would be good. After all, tomorrow was, as the old cliché put it, the first day of the rest of her life here in France. And it was a life that she intended to make the most of from here on in. if it wasn't too late, she wanted to become part of a family again, to build a proper relationship with Elodie, to say sorry to Gabby for her behaviour, to ask their forgiveness for her past actions. If it did prove too late to mend the past and move forward together, she'd leave and try to accept the fact that sometimes it was impossible to right a wrong, and that all those years ago she'd irrevocably screwed up her life forever. She would have at least tried. Chapter 2. In the middle of all the chaos of helping her grandmother organise the move to France, Elodie had also been busy trying to put together a plan for her future freelance writing life. She was so looking forward to living in France, getting away from her dead-end life in the UK, and writing about things she was passionate about. Since returning from France in the new year, she'd turned down new copywriting commissions from the advertising company, which had been her main source of income, to concentrate on finding new outlets for her own writing. She hadn't closed the door totally on the copywriting, but had explained she needed a few weeks to help her grandmother move. Secretly, she was hoping not to have to do any more work for them, that her features about her new life and interesting places on the French Riviera would earn her enough money. She realised it wasn't going to be easy, setting herself up as an expat journalist, trying to sell features to the UK media about life in France. People who were already established were struggling to find outlets for their work, as print newspapers and magazines disappeared. So, she had to find new outlets and offer editors something different. So, as well as helping Gabby sort everything out as they had prepared to leave Dartmouth, Elodie had been busy pitching her ideas to magazines and newspapers about writing travel and lifestyle features. Philosophically, she accepted that it was a hard market to break into, but she intended to do her utmost to find a niche in it somewhere, somehow. She'd already secured a year's contract for a monthly column of 500 words about my new life on the Riviera for their local paper in Devon, the Dartmouth Chronicle. The pay was minimal, but it would be syndicated in the publisher's other papers along the south coast and get her name out there on a regular basis. The first column was due next week, so she needed to think about starting to write it. And of course, the added bonus to living down here was that she had a new man in her life. Gaz. Elodie smiled to herself as she thought about him. From the moment they'd been introduced at his parents' Christmas aperitif party, there had been a connection between them, despite his friend, Fiona, laying a possessive hand on his arm at every opportunity. Gaz had assured Elodie they weren't officially an item, despite Fiona trying to show otherwise, and she'd believed him. Seeing Gaz standing next to Philippe, his grandfather, waiting to greet them in arrivals at the airport early this morning, ready to drive them to Villa de l'Espoir, had made her heart skip a beat, as had the welcoming kiss he'd given her. She knew, too, that Gabby had been more than happy to see Philippe, waiting to welcome them. Now, as Elodie set up her computer on the desk in front of her bedroom window, she glanced out at the view over the front garden and the green in the middle of the cul-de-sac, remembering the first time she'd seen the villa, back in December. Gabby had told her that it had been the Jacques family home since the end of the 19th century, when it had been built by her great-great-grandfather. Unusual in design for its age, it was a sprawling villa, built of the warm-hued local stone, the terracotta tiles of the roof bleached to a pale pink by the sun over the last century. Elodie had fallen in love with the place that first time she'd seen the villa, feeling as if she'd come home from the moment she'd walked in through the front door. Elodie had been shocked to learn, on that first visit, that Gabby had owned the house since the death of her estranged father 10 years ago. Since then, the villa had been rented out, and Gabby had told Elodie that the rent money had been put into a savings account for her, which she would gain access to on her 25th birthday. But the happy surprise of learning about the villa, and what she'd laughingly called her unexpected trust fund, had been buried by the Christmas surprise to trump all surprises. Whilst the news about the villa had been a good one, full of possibilities for the future, the news that her long-lost mother wanted to be back in her life had not been so welcome. Elodie sighed. Even now, months later, if she put her hand on her heart, she couldn't honestly admit to being happy about the reunion. Sure, overtures had been made, regrets acknowledged, hopes for the future voiced, but there was still a tentative nature to the relationship between herself and her mother. Walking on eggshells, Gabby called it. Harriet had even expressed the hope that time spent together in Dartmouth packing up the house would help her and Elodie get to know each other before the move. Hadn't happened, though, had it? Harriet had only turned up when most of the work had been done, leaving no time for any real mother and daughter closeness to establish itself. It was all very well saying she wanted to be reunited with the family, but being with them all the time already seemed like a step too far for her. Harriet had also told Elodie privately that she'd give living en famille in Villa de l'Espoir a 3-month trial. If she felt it wasn't working at the end of that time, then she intended to move out. Something which Elodie knew would upset Gabby, especially if Harriet not only left the villa, but moved away from France as well. That was something which Elodie didn't want to be responsible for. Remembering the scene in Nice airport as the three of them had spent time in duty-free before flying back to the UK, Elodie gave a wry smile. She had been the one to liken Harriet's unexpected arrival to a Christmas present they would never forget. But she couldn't help worrying. What if their fractured relationship remained broken? Would it turn into the proverbial poison chalice, with every Christmas from now on being remembered for the failure of that particular year? There was so much that needed to be asked, talked about, and to come to terms with before they could all move on. Once all the facts, the misconceptions, everything was out in the open, who knew whether that would turn out to be a good or a bad thing? Elodie groaned. Now they were all together in Villa de l'Espoir. She would have to try to graciously accept the fact that Harriet was back in her and Gabby's lives, whilst deep down she was still aggrieved with her mother for leaving her 20 years ago. There were still so many unanswered questions about the past buzzing around in her brain. Questions only Harriet could answer. Questions she sensed that Harriet was reluctant to divulge the answers to. Gabby would probably advise her to let sleeping dogs lie. No point in dragging up the past when it was the present and the future that truly mattered. The last thing Elodie wanted to do was create a situation that would hurt Gabby. But deep down she knew that, come what may, there was one question in particular that she had every intention of pressing Harriet for an answer on. Who was her father? And once she knew his name, the next two questions would need answering. Why wasn't his name on her birth certificate? And, importantly, why had he never been in her life? Chapter 3. Downstairs, Gabby was gazing around distractedly, wondering where on earth she could put things in this kitchen with its limited number of units. In her mother's day, it had been a real family kitchen, large enough for freestanding cupboards, a long pine table and chairs, and a big old-fashioned range-type cooker. Gabby smiled to herself as the memory of the day their first ever fridge arrived popped into her mind. Her mother had been beside herself with delight as she planned where in the kitchen it should go. Today, the big American-style fridge they'd brought with them was plugged in, albeit on an adapter for the English plug in the same place. The one length of working surface under the window had the kettle, the microwave, and the remains of the makeshift meals, sandwiches, crisps, and tea they'd eaten today. The bowl in the sink was full of dirty mugs and plates. Piles of crockery, cooking utensils, saucepans and cutlery were all piled haphazardly on the kitchen table they'd brought over from Dartmouth. Flattened, empty cardboard boxes were stacked in a corner. Sorting the kitchen would have to be their first priority, Gabby decided. Turning it into a kitchen that was at the heart of the home she and her family were sharing. Gabby smiled. Her family. Having her daughter back in her life as well as Elodie was something that she'd long given up even dreaming about. Now it had happened, she was determined to do everything in her power to make it a success, so that Harriet would never want to leave again, and, importantly, she and Elodie would form a proper mother-daughter bond. The last 20 years of caring for Elodie alone, trying to be a mother as well as a grandmother, hadn't been easy, but the love she had for Elodie had carried her through the difficult times. These days, she and Elodie had a close, loving bond, but Gabby knew that nothing could take the place of a real mother-daughter bond, like the one she sensed still lurked in the shadows between herself and Harriet. They'd been so close once upon a time. Gabby smothered a sigh. She could only hope and pray that the fractured family bonds between the three of them would all heal in the coming months. Gabby began to pick up the cardboard. Tonight they were eating out. So she'd leave trying to sort the kitchen until tomorrow and take the cardboard to the garage out of the way. Opening the internal door to the garage in the hallway, Gabby stood at the top of the flight of steps that led down and threw the cardboard onto the garage floor below. She remembered how easy the steps were to fall down, and there was no way she was going to risk the descent with her arms full. Coming back up empty-handed would be fine. Once down in the garage, Gabby picked up the cardboard and placed it near the closed garage doors, ready to take to a recycling point when they found one, before looking around. The small window on the side had thick iron bars fixed to the outside, something she didn't remember being there before. The garage was empty, save for the large box Gabby had remembered at the last moment being in the Dartmouth house attic, and one of the removal men had peevishly climbed up to fetch it. A floor-to-ceiling unit of wooden shelves was in the centre of the back wall. Absently, she ran a finger along one of the empty shelves, cutting through a layer of dust. In the past, they'd held a diverse collection of what her mother had always called utter déchets, in a disparaging tone of voice. Tins of half-used paint, grease guns, spark plugs, nails, screws, brushes, broken tools. Like the kitchen was her mother's domain, the garage had been her father's, although rarely used for its original purpose back then, as he always parked outside, on the drive, in front of the double doors. It was only when he acquired a Renault 4L in the late 60s that he started to park the car in the garage. But even then, there was always lots of boxes filled with the next dodgy business opportunity to come his way. Now, standing in what had been his carefully guarded empire all those years ago, Gabby stifled a laugh as she realised something for the first time. Her father, Hervé, had been the French equivalent of Del Boy from the English sitcom Only Fools and Horses that Eric had loved to watch. It was only now she realised why she hadn't shared her husband's love of the programme. In many ways, it had unconsciously reminded her of her father. Hervé had inherited the house from his father, who, following the family tradition of being a successful businessman, had left Hervé not only the villa, but a substantial fortune in the bank as well. Sadly, Hervé did not follow in the businesslike footsteps of his forebears. Instead, he flitted from one business to another like a moth around a flame, blaming everyone but himself when he failed, yet again. If only he'd been more like the lovable rogue that was Del Boy, instead of the man he was, her life might have been different. Gabby pushed the memories of her father away. It was all too long ago to have any bearing on her life now. She might be living back in the house she'd been born in and where she'd spent her childhood, but it was a new beginning. Past memories would not be allowed to surface and spoil things. Crossing the empty space and moving towards the stairs, she wondered about getting a car. Would they need one? Public transport in Dartmouth had always been somewhat hit and miss, making a car essential. Here, on the Riviera, there were trains and buses running inland and along the coast all hours of the day. Harriet and Elodie might decide a car was needed, but she was quite happy to catch a bus or train, if where she wanted to go was too far to walk. Besides, Philippe had a car, and she knew he'd be more than happy to drive her wherever she wanted. Gabby smiled to herself. Dear Philippe. Both in their 70s, both single. There had been an instant bond between the two of them from the moment they'd met last Christmas. Jessica Vincent, owner of the apartment Elodie had found for them to rent over Christmas and the New Year, had invited them to a festive drinks party. When they arrived, Jessica had immediately taken Elodie off to meet some of the younger guests, including her son Gaz, whilst Michael, her husband, had taken Gabby to meet his reprobate of a father. Gabby had found Philippe, still a handsome man with more than a touch of the French actor Jean-Paul Belmondo about him, to be delightful company that evening, and in the following days. This morning at the airport, when she'd walked into Philippe's open arms and received a tight, welcoming hug, she'd felt an all-enveloping sense of relief, and of being exactly where she wanted to be, and importantly, where she was wanted. As Gabby reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the hallway, Harriet appeared from upstairs. I've made up your bed, Mum, so you don't have to worry about that before or after we go out. Anything interesting down there? She asked, as Gabby closed the door to the garage. Gabby shook her head. Nothing. Shall we call Elodie down and go find somewhere to eat? I'm quite hungry. I've decided to leave the kitchen for now. No need to call. I'm here, Elodie said, running down the stairs. I'm starving and ready to go. 20 minutes later, they were sitting at a table on the pavement outside one of the restaurants they discovered at Christmas, in the heart of Juan-les-Pins. A bottle of rosé on the table, and their food order, moule and frites for the three of them, given to the young waiter. Around them, there was a buzz of chatter, as locals were joined by early holiday-makers, enjoying their meals, sitting out in the warm night air. Elodie sighed happily as she picked up her glass. Santé! Here's to us and our new lives. The three of them clinked glasses and took sips. I can hardly believe we've made it to France, Elodie said. I am so looking forward to living here. There's a lot to sort out, Gabby said, starting with the kitchen. First, the walls need painting, and we need to find either some units or some standalone cupboards that we can put things in. Goodness only knows where everything is going to go in the meantime. No worries, Harriet said, sensing Gabby was feeling overwhelmed. I'll get some paint tomorrow and make a start on the walls. Once they're done, we can decide whether we want a fitted kitchen or a more traditional one. In which case, we'll pay that brocante Elodie discovered at Christmas a visit and see what we can find. We'll fill the fridge with salads and charcuterie and eat croissants from the nearest boulangerie for breakfast. If we eat out a couple of evenings, use the microwave and order in takeaways occasionally, we can exist for a few weeks without doing any real cooking. Think that's a plan? Definitely, Elodie said, for once in total agreement with her mother. Chapter 4. Elodie woke with a start the next morning as the alarm on her phone buzzed into life with a rousing chorus of La Marseillaise. She'd decided to use the French national anthem as a wake-up call to remind her she was now living in France. As if she'd ever forget. She lay there for a few moments before flinging the duvet aside, getting up and making for the shower in her ensuite bathroom. Half an hour later, she was showered, dressed, and heading out of the front door for the nearest boulangerie she could find, to buy the baguettes and croissants ready for their first breakfast out on the terrace, overlooking the pool. At Christmas, when she'd regularly done the breakfast run to the boulangerie, her route had taken her along the Promenade du Soleil for several metres before needing to turn down one of the small streets leading into Juan-les-Pins centre. Today, because the villa was set back inland from the seafront, Elodie found herself in the centre of Juan within minutes, the tantalising smell of freshly baked bread drifting towards her from a boulangerie she recognised. Both the croissants and the baguette were still warm, and Elodie was glad she'd remembered to bring the canvas shopping tote with her. Leaving the shop, she hesitated before turning for home. Part of her longed to wander along the bord de mer first, see if Gaz was on the beach early, preparing for a busy day with the holidaymakers. Much to the worry of his parents, Gaz had decided at the end of the previous year that living and working in Paris was not for him, and he was now the new owner of a jet ski and paragliding beach business in Juan. But another part of Elodie was worried that she'd be a nuisance if he was busy. Yesterday, when he and Philippe had driven them from the airport to the villa, he'd said he was expecting a delivery today of some new paddleboards. Elodie gave a sigh. It'd be better to go straight back to the villa with breakfast, just in case. Maybe she'd wander down to the beach later in the day. Back at the villa, Gabby was in the kitchen organising coffee, while Harriet was out on the terrace, arranging the small garden table and a couple of outdoor chairs they brought from Devon. Elodie, placing plates and the croissants on the table, glanced at her mother. Was the time right to start asking questions? Or should she leave it until they were all more settled into life here? As she finally decided she'd say something and opened her mouth to speak, Gabby appeared with the coffee, and Elodie knew the moment was lost. Her questions would have to wait a little longer. As they ate breakfast, the three of them began to plan their day. Harriet wanted to buy some paint and make a start on the kitchen walls. Gabby said she'd potter around the villa and unpack some more things. Yesterday, Philippe had promised he'd pop in during the morning to give her a hand if she needed it, and she was looking forward to that. Elodie loved how Gabby's face lit up these days whenever she mentioned Philippe. I need to take a few photos for my first column in the Chronicle, Elodie said, and I thought I'd find the brocante again and see if they have a dresser and possibly some outdoor furniture. She looked at Harriet. She had to make the effort. Shall we walk into town together? Why not? And the two of them left for town as soon as breakfast was finished. As they walked to the end of the impasse and reached the bigger road that would lead them into the centre of Juan-les-Pins, Elodie sighed happily. I'm so happy Gabby decided we could come and live here. She took a deep breath. She'd be even happier when she had the answers to the questions she was determined to ask Harriet. And now seemed like a good opportunity. You told me at Christmas that you loved me and hated leaving me behind, but you still married Todd and went to Australia without me. Harriet tensed. She should have realised Elodie would seize the opportunity to probe into the past, particularly her past. She just hadn't expected it this morning. You also said It didn't take long for you to realise you'd made a huge mistake. But you did nothing to change things. To come back. Silence followed Elodie's words as she looked at Harriet. It became impossible to leave. Harriet said eventually, my pride wouldn't let me admit to Gabby how things were. She'd never really taken to Todd, and had urged me several times not to marry him. She always thought, apart from being too old for me, that he wasn't the right man for me. I decided I had to stick it out and try to change things. Basically, I determined to change Todd's behaviour towards me. I naively thought that was a real possibility. Harriet shrugged. Never believe that loving someone will be enough to change them. People have to want to change themselves. And Todd liked me being under his control, so was never going to change. But even when you finally returned to Europe last year after being away for 20 years, you didn't seek us out immediately. You went and lived in Bristol, and it was months before you contacted Gabby. You also promised you'd help with packing up to move here. But you were very last minute. So in the end, not much use at all. Harriet gave a rueful nod, hearing the accusatory note in Elodie's voice. I know. I'm sorry. Stupidly, when I first came back, I was terrified that neither of you would want me in your lives again. And then, when we did get together, down here over Christmas and the New Year, Gabby welcomed me back with open arms. But you had to make more of an effort. True? Elodie pulled a face, acknowledging the truth of Harriet's words. Yes, I found it hard to trust or accept you, the way Gabby wanted me to. Harriet gave her a look. The unspoken question, you still don't, totally, do you? Somehow manifested itself in the air, and Elodie looked away. It was difficult for me too, Harriet said quietly. When we all returned to the UK, and I left you at Bristol Airport, I started to worry about it all going wrong. That the apparent success of the Christmas get-together was merely an illusion. All down to the fact that Christmas is always traditionally supposed to be a happy time and reunite families. I became convinced it was all bound to fall apart again. That's why I kept putting off joining you. But I'm here now. In the silence that followed her words, the two of them continued to walk, their pace slower, both deep in thought. It was Elodie who broke the silence a couple of moments later. Yes, you're here now. Will you stay, though? You need to think about Gabby. She loves the fact that we're all living here together. She'd be heartbroken to lose you again. So please make it work for her sake. She's mourned your absence for years, she said. Our relationship has time to sort itself out.